Okay guys, welcome to the first Ableton Live tutorial on the course. In this tutorial we're just going to have a little bit of a look at the Ableton Live interface and various features of the browser. Although the browser I'll be using here is Ableton Live 9, there are some similar features to the browser in Live 8. It looks a little bit different, but the ideas are the same, so we'll have a look at it, a couple of things with the browser as well. So if we look at the interface here, the first thing a lot of people notice when they first start to use Ableton Live is that the interface can look slightly different to other DAWs such as Cubase, Pro Tools and Logic or Reason or something like that. And that's because in one of Ableton Live's two views, i.e. session view, which is the one we're looking at here, the tracks are actually laid out horizontally. So if I add in a few more tracks here, you can see that the tracks names are laid out horizontally, meaning that the content within them is laid out vertically. Now in Ableton Live we have two different types of tracks. We can have audio and MIDI tracks, and within those tracks we have what are called clips. Clips can contain MIDI information or audio information. Okay, so audio clips go in audio tracks and MIDI clips go in MIDI tracks, and they can't go in each other's tracks. So within the tracks we have running down vertically across the screen here what are called clip slots, and recording audio into an audio clip is something that we'll look at in a few weeks, but for now let's just see that within these clip slots we can double click in a MIDI track and we can create a MIDI clip. Okay, so notice that double clicking within those clip slots creates a MIDI track, a MIDI clip that defaults to 1 bar. Okay, so the length of the MIDI clip defaults to 1 bar. Now then, we can delete MIDI clips just by pressing backspace. We can also select different clip slots using the arrow keys. So I'm just using the up and down arrow keys on the keyboard there to go up and delete these clips. Alright, so the flow of time really is the important thing to bear in mind here, guys. Okay, normally within Cubase, Logic, Pro Tools or whatever, you would see a flow of time going from left to right. Okay, here in the session view, which is the view that we'll be using the most at the start of the course, we have control over the flow of time. If I put a few more clips into these clip slots, I can play the clip at the top there. I can decide that I want to play this clip here next. It takes over from that clip. Alright, so there's something else to notice. We can only play one clip at a time per track. Okay, if I put in another MIDI track here, and I'll put a few more MIDI clips in, we can play clips across different tracks at the same time, but we can only play one clip per track. Alright, so thinking about the flow of time then, we have control over the flow of time on the material on each track. Okay, so we decide when each clip within each track starts and stops. Okay, so let's have a little look at the other view that we've got with Ableton Live. I mentioned before that this view that we're looking at here is called session view, but we also have a more traditional view within Ableton Live which is called the arrangement view. We get to the arrangement view by pressing tab on the computer keyboard, and there it is. Now that's a little bit more of a traditional look. Okay, here you can see on the right here, these are all of our tracks listed from top to bottom, and then we've got a flow of time here going from left to right. Okay, so if I was to transfer some information from session view over to arrangement view by pressing on this clip, hitting tab and then dropping the clip into the start here, I'll just drag that out so you can see it a little bit better. And if I hit enter to go back and press play, you can see that the play marker is moving along from left to right there, as you would normally expect. So this is a bit more of a traditional look to a DAW, a look that you'll have seen in other DAWs and sequences, I'm sure. Okay, so we have arrangement view, And if we hit tab, we can go over to session view. Session view is the one that's unique to Ableton Live, and it really is the combination of session view and arrangement view and the ways that you can use those two views together, which make Ableton Live so powerful and so much fun to work with creatively. Okay, so that's the two views. Let's have a look at the browser over here. You can see that there are various different categories listed down the left. As I've said, you'll be using Live 8, so the browser will look slightly different, but the important things to look for are instruments and audio effects for now. Okay, so within instruments we have various different MIDI instruments. We'll be using analog quite a lot as we start off, and it's very easy to drag a MIDI instrument onto a MIDI track. You simply click and drag and drop it at the top there. Okay, so I dropped that analog on the name label of the MIDI track, and as you can see, it's input an analog device down here. Okay, if I go to this clip and put in some simple MIDI information, we can see that that MIDI information is triggering a sound from analog. If I click on the track name label and highlight analog and delete, and then trigger this clip again, we get no sound this time because I've removed the MIDI device. Okay, so we need a MIDI device for the MIDI information to trigger. Alright, so that's a MIDI instrument. We can also put on something like an audio effect. So if I go back, I'll just drag analog over again. Notice that as well as dragging it onto the name label, you can drag it down here to the device area. Okay, we can do the same with an audio effect. So if I decide that I want reverb on this analog track, then I can drag it in here and put it after the analog MIDI device and get some sort of reverb sound. Okay, so we can use different instruments and different audio effects. We can drag those in from the browser. As I've said, it's slightly different in Live 8, but we'll go through it in the class. Experiment on Live 8 if you're using it now and get to know where the MIDI devices are and where the audio effects are. Finish off this first video by looking at a few of the features within Ableton Live that you can access via both the session view and the arrangement view. So if we look first up at the top left here, if you follow my mouse cursor, we've got a function called tap tempo. Alright, so if I tap this 4 times, the sequencer begins. And this is also a function by where we can change the tempo, okay, by tapping in, and that's very helpful if you're playing along to a band or something like that. If you've got your laptop set up in a situation with a live band, you can tap along and get this Ableton Live sequencer in time with those guys. You can also use this main tempo you can drag and change the tempo up and down, or you can click and use the keypad, okay, to enter a tempo there and press enter to enter the tempo. Okay, this is time signature, which we won't really worry about too much for the minute. We'll just leave that on 4/4. This button switches your metronome on and off. Alright, that's an important one to know. I'll just stop all these clips. If I hit the sequencer there and put the metronome on, it's very fast because I changed this to 5/2/3, but I'll just change it back to 120. Okay, so that's a good one to know. That's your metronome. Up here we have a pretty standard transport control. This is to start and stop the main sequencer. Alright, so we've got a play button, a stop button, and a record button, which we'll look at in future tutorials. Okay, so we've got some basic features there that you might see in other DAWs as well as in Ableton Live. Okay, that's pretty much it for the first tutorial. Get used to the interface and how it looks and how the two interfaces can be switched between, and we'll move on to something a little bit more complex in the next tutorial.